the mountain that never reveals its secrets. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night because something outside your tent has gone terribly wrong. You're in the middle of nowhere. There are no roads to no nearby towns. No cell phone reception.
Just a frozen mountain, a strong wind, and darkness stretching in all directions, and whatever it is that scares you.
It's scary enough that you decide your tent is more dangerous than the frozen wilderness outside, so you don't take anything. Not your boots, not your coat, not even the clothes you were supposed to wear to bed. Instead, you cut your way out of the tent and run into the night. That's what makes the Dyatlov Pass Incident so disturbing.
Because 9 experienced climbers would make that decision on a freezing night in the Ural Mountains, and before sunrise, all 9 would be dead.
But here's the part that has kept people debating this case for more than 6 decades. What could possibly be inside that tent that would be terrifying enough to send 9 experienced climbers running into the darkness?
The last night, February 1st, 1959, Soviet Union, deep in the northern Ural Mountains. A group of 10 hikers had set out on a journey through one of the harshest environments they could have chosen.
They were no inexperienced tourists. They were young men who knew how to survive in the mountains. They were trained. They had sufficient physical capabilities. They understood winter travel.
And their expedition leader, 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, had already established a reputation as an experienced skier and mountaineer. The group set out from Sverdlovsk with the plan to cross the mountains and eventually reach Mount Otorten.
There were 10 of them when they began the journey, but one of the members, Yuri Yudin, fell ill during the expedition and was forced to turn back. It was a decision that would save his life. Yudin would later become the only member of the original group able to tell the story from an outsider's perspective.
The other 9 men continued on. Igor died. Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustim Slobodin, Lyudmila Dubinina, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Grifonisenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Saibo-Briknol, and Semyon Zolotaryov.
9 people at one mountain and one last night. The group had documented their journey with photographs. One of the last known photos shows the climbers working in the snow as they prepare their campsite. At first glance, there's nothing supernatural about it. They're just setting up camp.
But knowing what happened next makes the photo incredibly unsettling to look at. Because the people were alive. They were moving. They didn't realize they were facing their final hours.
And somewhere around that night, something changed. The group stopped. They set up camp on the slopes of Koletsk. The name is often translated from the local Man's language as Dead Mountain. That detail sounds almost too perfect for a horror story. But the mountain wasn't named that because of the Dyatlov group. The mountain already had that name. And that night, the 9 climbers would give the mountain another reason to be remembered.
The tent. This is where the story gets strange. The hikers had everything they needed to survive. They had clothes. They had shelter.
But something happened inside that tent. And whatever it was, they didn't leave the normal way. They cut their way out from the inside. That's one of the most notorious details of the whole case. The tent was later found abandoned with personal belongings still inside. Their shoes were there. Their clothes were there. The equipment was there. The food was left behind.
The scene didn't look like 9 people calmly deciding to pack up and move on. It looked like they left in a hurry, a lot of haste. And think about what that means.
If you're camping in the Ural Mountains, in the middle of winter, you wouldn't just walk out without boots. You wouldn't just leave your coat behind. You wouldn't leave behind the things that keep you alive. Because outside the tent was uncomfortable, it was deadly terrifying. The wind made the environment even more dangerous. But the climbers went out anyway.
Some went without proper footwear, some were barely clothed, and they walked away from the tent, toward the forest, away from the only shelter they had. That decision is at the heart of this mystery, because whatever happened next must explain one simple question. Why did 9 experienced men choose to freeze to death rather than stay inside their tent?
Footprints. When the search finally began, investigators discovered something else. There were footprints leading away from the tent, and those footprints became one of the most chilling clues in the entire case, because they showed that the hikers hadn't just vanished. They had walked away. Some appeared to be wearing only socks. Some were barefoot. Some were wearing only partial footwear.
They weren't dressed for a long trek. They hadn't brought their full gear, and they weren't prepared to spend the night out. Whatever they believed was happening, they seemed to think they could go back. That's important, because it changes the question. Maybe they weren't trying to escape forever. Maybe they believed the danger in the tent was temporary.
Maybe they thought they could move into the woods, wait for whatever was happening to pass, and then come back. And if that were the case, that decision suddenly became very logical. Imagine you're in that tent. You hear something. Maybe you feel the tent moving. Maybe you hear the snow shifting. Maybe you think the mountain above you is going to collapse. You don't know exactly what's happening, but you believe the tent is no longer safe.
So you make your way out. You tell everyone to move, and you head down toward the trees. Because trees mean shelter, fire, protection from the wind, a chance to survive. You intend to turn back, but the mountain won't give you that chance.
The first bodies. The search team didn't find all 9 bodies at once. That's another reason why this case remains so elusive. The first bodies were found near the forest. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko were found near the remains of a campfire.
They were not properly dressed for the conditions, and the scene suggested something tragic. They appeared to have been trying to survive. They had made a campfire. They had reached the trees. Perhaps they thought they had found temporary safety, but the cold overcame them.
Then investigators found Igor Dyatlov and Zinaida Kolmogorova. They were found further up the slope toward the tent. Rustem Slobodin was also found between the tent and the forest. The position of these bodies suggested something very human. They were probably trying to return back to the tent, back to the warmth, back to the equipment they had left behind. But they never arrived.
One by one, the cold claimed their lives. And then the bodies turned up that made this case famous. Because the first death was potentially explainable. Hypothermia, exposure to extreme weather, fatal decisions in extreme weather. But 4 of the climbers suffered severe traumatic injuries. And suddenly, this story became much more difficult to explain.
Injuries. Nikolai Thibault Brignol suffered severe skull injuries. 2 other hikers, Semyon Zolotaryov and Lyudmila Dubinina, suffered severe chest trauma. The injuries were serious enough to raise obvious questions. What happened to these people? If they simply froze to death, why did some of them have such severe injuries? And if a powerful force struck them, what was it?
This is where the Dyatlov Pass Incident transformed from a tragic wilderness accident into something that sounded almost impossible, because the bodies were not all found in the same place. The hikers were separated. Some were near the forest, others were found farther away, and the four most severely injured were found later, in a ravine beneath the snow.
The location was important because it offered one possible explanation for the injuries. But for decades, no satisfactory answers were forthcoming, and when a mystery has no answer, people start filling in the gaps.
The details that make this case legendary. Over the years, some details of the Dyatlov case have become almost inseparable from the mythology surrounding it. Two of the bodies were missing eyes. Ludmila Dubinina was also missing her tongue. There were reports of unusual injuries. Some clothing later showed traces of radioactive contamination, and there were reports of strange lights in the sky around the time of the incident.
Put all those details together, and you have the ingredients for almost any conspiracy theory you can imagine. Secret Soviet weapons, military tests, nuclear experiments, the KGB, foreign spies, aliens, unknown atmospheric phenomena, even a possible attack. But here's the thing. A mysterious story can become more mysterious, with each unexplained detail added.
And sometimes, the explanation is far less dramatic. For example, the loss of an eye and a tongue doesn't automatically mean something attacked. The hikers, a corpse exposed to harsh environmental conditions, can undergo decomposition and predation, and the fact that some clothing contains traces of radioactivity is certainly strange, but strange doesn't automatically mean nuclear weapons. There's the possibility of commonplace contamination, and that distinction is important.
Because if you're trying to solve a mystery, you have to separate the truly inexplicable from the things that just sound inexplicable. But even after you've eliminated some of the mythology, the main mystery remains. Why did the 9 people leave the tent?
Soviet investigation. The Soviet investigation ultimately concluded that the climbers died from what was described as a powerful force of nature. This was a very vague conclusion. It didn't explain what happened. It didn't explain the tent's presence. It didn't explain why they fled. It didn't explain the injuries they sustained. It basically just said,
something in nature caused this. And that ambiguity is what helps the mystery persist. Because if investigators had concluded that a specific avalanche had struck the tent, the case might have been a bizarre but understandable mountaineering accident. Instead, the official explanation left a huge gap, and into that gap, theories arose.
Attack theories. One theory is that the hikers were attacked, perhaps by criminals, perhaps by locals, perhaps by someone who wanted them dead. But there's a pressing problem. There's no convincing evidence of a violent human attack. The hikers weren't found at a conventional crime scene. There were no obvious traces of a killer. There was no clear motive.
and the condition of the tent and the surrounding area didn't lend itself to a simple explanation. This theory doesn't quite explain it. Then there's a more exotic version. Perhaps the group encountered something unknown, something that frightened them so much that they fled. It's a compelling story. But compelling isn't the same as supported. There's no hard evidence that a Yeti attacked the hikers.
There's no credible evidence that extraterrestrials were involved. And there's no reliable evidence that the hikers were killed by a covert Soviet operation. These theories are compelling, but that's not a fact. And that's where the Dyatlov mystery gets interesting. Because the strongest explanation doesn't require monsters. It doesn't require spies. It doesn't require aliens. Maybe it just requires snow.
The Avalanche theory. For years, the avalanche theory had its problems. The tent wasn't located below a slope that was clearly visible in the avalanche's path. there were no traces of the dramatic avalanche one might expect, and the injuries seemed strange. Why could a relatively small avalanche cause such severe chest and skull injuries? And why did the climbers abandon the tent if the avalanche had already passed? The questions continued to mount.
But then scientists returned to the mountain. Not just legends, not just photographs, the actual terrain, the actual snow, the weather, how the wind moved the snow, and how the snow layer could collapse.
In 2021, researchers Johan Go and Alexander published a study in Communications Earth and Environment, examining whether a slab avalanche could occur at the site. Their conclusion wasn't that they had definitively solved the case. Moreover, their conclusions were more rigorous. They showed that delayed detachment of the snow layer was physically plausible.
And their proposed mechanism was intriguing, because the avalanche didn't have to happen immediately after the climbers cut the slope to set up their tent. It could have taken hours. Wind could have moved the snow. The snow could have piled up on top of the tent. A weak layer could have existed beneath it. And finally, the snow could have collapsed.
The researchers calculated that detachment could have occurred about 7.5 to 13.5 hours after the slope was cut. That's important, because one of the classic objections to the avalanche theory is timing. The climbers didn't necessarily set up their tent immediately and get buried.
Delayed failure could explain why. Their simulations showed that even a relatively small avalanche could potentially cause serious but non-fatal injuries if someone were trapped between the falling snow and the solid surface below. Suddenly, one of the strangest parts of the case had a possible physical explanation.
But there was something even more intriguing. The researchers then returned to the area, and on a follow-up expedition, they documented a slab avalanche in the area. That doesn't prove that an avalanche killed the Dyatlov group, but it makes the idea much harder to dismiss as impossible.